I came across a video recently in connection with the controversial US healthcare reform that the President has proposed across the country. It stated BreakTheMatrix's opposition to the idea and went into a little explanation based on none other than an episode of Battlestar Galactica.
Along the way, they discover a planet that's capable of sustaining human life, but just barely. Now, this planet is discovered right before the presidential election, and one of the candidates decides to build his platform around the appealing utopian idea of settling on the new planet, even though he knows it's not viable. Of course, as I'm watching this, I'm yelling at the people not to fall for it, but they want so badly to believe there's a solution, they end up voting him into office. You can probably predict what happens after they settle there. The harsh reality sets in, things spiral out of control, and they end up forced to suffer through the disastrous consequences of their decision.
The problem with such an argument is twofold. The first is that, to the best of my knowledge, President Obama did not make healthcare reform a major part of his campaign. The second and most obvious point is that using a science fiction television show to make a point about healthcare reform is problematic, as you can use the same show to make any point you wish to, and your opposition can use it to make the opposing point. Allow me to demonstrate how. The following clip can be used by Luddites and technophobes to make a case for getting rid of scientific inquiry in technology.
You know, our brains have always outraced our hearts. Our science charges ahead, our souls lag behind. Let's start anew.
Before I continue, it is clear that these events never happened, and that this show is a work of fiction from the minds of two 21st century television producers. One needs to bear this in mind when dealing with the points made. The problem with using this clip to make a point for removing technological progress is simple. Technology has given us countless improvements to our lives, improvements that even Luddites take advantage of daily whether they realize it or not. Improvements that would otherwise leave humans with an average lifespan of less than 30 years were these improvements not developed. Some of these improvements include clean running water, worldwide travel, instant worldwide communication, number crunching power unrivaled by all humans, advanced medical care and treatments that prevent all kinds of conditions, virtually limitless information storage and indexing abilities, and so on. To take one example, without the instantaneous storage and retrieval of information via the use of computers and the internet, we would be in a far worse position as a species without the ability to store knowledge and retrieve it whenever it is required. This is one of the tools through which we are able to essentially prevent knowledge from being destroyed by overzealous religious fundamentalists whose crusades of book burning and decrees of heresy against anyone who proposed ideas outside of the status quo had resulted in needless death and suffering, as well as the impediment of progress by several centuries. The idea that we should abandon technology because
Brains have always outraced our hearts. Our science charges ahead, our souls lag behind.
is in itself a path to needless death and suffering, and is one that I will not have condoned had it truly happened. But back to the main point. Using an argument from a TV show to support a real-world premise is not a good idea, especially in light of the fact that the two arguments are non-comparable. As for the issue of medical reform, let's set aside the issue of standard medical visits and treatment. Regular hospital visits are of course necessary for some people and can be debated as a matter of private versus public, but I want to address the issue of emergency treatment and call-outs. It would be beneficial overall if, as part of any healthcare reform, the emergency medical services were taken out of private hands and put into the hands of the government. It's really rather simple. If you are suddenly thrust into an emergency medical situation, the last thing you need is to consider not calling an ambulance or go to the hospital just because of the possible expense if there's a possibility that you are in a life-threatening medical emergency and time is of the essence. Here in the UK, you will never be involved in the expense situation of having a hospital visit, and you will always get attended by an ambulance if the medical situation is an emergency one. Whatever scare stories people like to throw around out there, the normal situation is that the system works. The people are taken to hospital when they need it most, and they never have to worry about payment, insurance, or medical coverage. It is all part of the system here. And for one final point,
Of course, as I'm watching this, I'm yelling at the people not to fall for it, but they want...
Screaming at your television set on a show that was pre-recorded and pre-scripted isn't going to change the outcome, but rather makes you look a little insane. Perhaps you should avoid doing this if you want your viewers to think you're not somewhat crazy. Just a thought.